New York City weather in May is particularly interesting. So, May is often seen as a transitional month in New York City weather, but I'm not totally sure I agree because once you get closer to summer, it just begins to become less transitional. That being said, I was actually kind of curious to see, has there recently been a time where New York City has hit the 90s and then after that made its way to the 40s? But to my surprise, that hasn't happened recently. In 2022, the final time that we made our way down to the 40s was on May 9th. And 12 days later, we made it to the 90s on May 21st. Well, some parts of the metro area then proceeded to plummet back down to the 40s on May 25th and 26th. Central Park failed to do so, bottoming out at 53 and 54 instead. And this is the first time that May saw a temperature in the 90s since 2018. And considering the last time that June saw a temperature in the 40s was back in 2000, which, by the way, fun fact, was the last time the same MLB team won the World Series twice in a row. That does say something. New York City came very close to having this happen in 2021, however. And some parts of the metro area did peak in the 90s on May 23rd. But on May 23rd, Central Park could only top out at 89. And some parts of the metro area during this time proceeded to make it to the 90s, multiple times during May. But everyone managed to cool down to the 40s at the end of the month. Considering that May 30th and 29th both had highs of only 51 degrees, it's easy to see why you could make it down to the 40s. Unless you had a 1 degree diurnal variation, which it was crummy out, but the variation was still more than 1 degree, it made it down to 47. The 47 wasn't a record, but the 51 on May 29th tied a record for the coldest high on that date. But the record was then smashed on May 30th when the high was also 51 degrees. That's also the coldest high temperature solely in the year. The record cold high for May 31st lies at about 57, and the coldest high temperature during the month of June is 52. So, it's the latest in the year that we saw a high temperature so low. Latest date for that. And while May 31st did clear out and have a high of a pretty beautiful 70, the low in the morning was still 49 degrees, coming just one day away from, again, a fateful 40s in June. But nonetheless, it could not make that mark. It just couldn't. And again, a lot of places in the metro area did manage to make their way up to the 90s during the month of May, but Central Park failed to do so. So that was a case of close, but no cigar. Central Park would make their way to the 90s on June 6th, but by that point, it was just too late. Now, heading deeper into Central Park's weather in May, what we have to understand is that in 2020, it made its way down to the 30s after its first high in the 80s. That's rare, and I do feel the need to point that out. It's even more rare than 70s into 20s, because if you think about it, once you get up to the 80s, it's usually late enough in the year to spare yourself from the 30s. 2021 was actually a case of that too, when we hit a searing 82 degrees as early as March 26th. Our first high in the 80s in May since 1998. But then we saw temperatures fall into the 20s even. 28 degrees on April 2nd, which had a high of only 38. Not a record, but still a very cool high for early April 2nd. So, again, that was exceptionally rare. But this year also had it, but on the opposite end. You know, we had a high of 80 degrees on May 3rd, and then a low of 34 degrees on May 9th, after a record low of 36 degrees on May 8th. We saw multiple days during that streak of temperatures in the 30s, and in some cases, highs can only make it to the upper 40s despite it being bright and sunny. And this is the weekend after we saw temperatures in the 80s. This was during COVID, and it was right before the reopening too. But that May would not even make it close to temperatures in the 80s. The highest temperature, the temperatures in the 90s. The highest temperature all May was it was 84 degrees. God, I can't speak today. And temperatures in the 90s would not make their way to New York City in 2020 until June 22nd. In 2019, it would be even later, June 28th, which, by the way, at that point, it's impossible to get a temperature in the 40s in Central Park. Some suburbs, even immediate suburbs, can make their way to the 40s during the time of July and August. Central Park just cannot do that. I know Islip can, and I think Newark might be able to as well. Now, heading into the year of 2019. 2019 was an interesting year because some outlying suburbs managed to cool to the 40s on June 1st. Central Park failed to do so. Oh no, maybe that was 2020, where some outlying suburbs managed to cool to the 40s on June 1st. I think in 2019 it happened on June 4th. But again, not at Central Park. And the first time that I hit the 90s in 2019 was, in fact, on June 28th or 29th. So, no surprises there that we couldn't do it. But 2018 really surprised me because in 2018, we hit the 90s on May 2nd and 3rd. The coldest reading all month was 48 degrees, though, and it fell on the 1st. The warmest was 92, and it fell on the 3rd. We also hit 90 degrees on May 2nd, which both of them were record-breaking. What surprised me, though, was the fact that 48 degrees was the last time that we made it our way down to the 40s. So aside from it being, pretty much back-to-back to see your warmest and coolest reading, so TypePad was wrong when he said the last time it happened was June of 2009. It was surprising to see that the last time we made our way to the 40s was on May 1st. It's usually later than that, and had that day occurred one day earlier, May would have simply failed to have produced a reading in the 40s. Nonetheless, the last 40s happened one day before the first 90s. Talk about a rapid change in conditions. And as a result, it still meant that we can't look to this. 2017 also offered me some optimistic hope because of the fact that it was in the 90s for 3 days in a row, a 3-day heat wave on May 17th to 19th. But then it wouldn't get to 70 degrees after that point until May 26th again. So I thought that through all those days in the 60s as a high, we can manage to make one day to have a low in the 40s, but I was wrong on that front. There definitely were temperatures in the 40s throughout May, but none after May 17th. So yeah. Now, the month of, the year of 2016 was a very interesting year as far as May weather went. Because when it opened up, there were days that had a high the same as the average low. And by the month's end, there were days that had a low, which was the same as the average high on the date. Definitely in the first part of the month, we saw tons of temperatures in the 40s and highs stuck in the low 50s. I think in the first week of the month, it wouldn't even make its way up to 60 degrees, which is sad. Then we had the middle part of the month with the most variable weather, and it did make its way down to 43 degrees on May 16th. But the last part of the month was hot, and I don't even think that we saw any lows in the 50s during that. If we did, definitely no 40s, and highs did make its way up to the 90s. As you know, by June, it's too late nowadays to see a temperature in the 40s, though June 2015 came very close when there was a low of 50 degrees on June 2nd. 1 degree off. And in the right month this time, but 1 degree too high. So you might think that, June would offer some hope, but it didn't, and nor did 2015, because surprisingly, despite being the second warmest May on record, temperatures did not manage to swimmer their way up into the 90s. The warmest reading all month was in the upper 80s. Despite hitting the 80s 18 times during the month, not one of those days could actually make their way into the 90s. 2014 did not see its first high in the 90s until July 2nd. Despite June having a low of 76 degrees, the warmest it got all month was 89. I didn't check some of the other months just out of, time cramp, but I think the most recent time it happened was in 2010. That was because it hit 92 degrees on April 7th, and of course it would make their way back down to the 40s. It would actually almost hit the 30s on April 28th. Nonetheless, the low was 40 degrees. So we could have seen a high in the 90s followed by a low in the 30s, but it was just a little bit too warm for that. That being said, however, we did manage to, make our way to see temperatures in the 40s occur as late as May 13th, and because of our super early reading in the 90s, that's how it's possible. So you really need either late readings in the 40s or early readings in the 90s for it to be possible, and you also need to just have some good luck. Finally, I want to end this video on a bit of a baseball-y note. In 2022, the Philadelphia Phillies made their way to the World Series since the first time since 2009, and in both cases they lost. One to the Yankees, one to the Astros. By the way, this is the last time the Yankees was in the World Series, was in 2009. And there's some interesting weather comparisons I can draw to this as well. In 2022, October wound up being the coolest since 2009. This is because of how the month opened up with Ian, and the fact that it pretty much, began on this cool note, and while it tried to turn itself around, it was just a little bit too late to do so, as early November was, again, very warm conditions. Funnily enough, I planned this video with a lot of comparisons, and I can only draw up with one.